I got myself into a world of trouble when I suggested that the first five books of the Bible were not written by Moses. And in fact, I suggested that the Bible has several authors, and people thought I'm losing my faith. Why? Because a lot of us in church world were taught not to question some of these things. We just accepted them as truth. Now, as a biblical scholar and pastor, I know that some people may not be ready for some of the truths that I'm going to share here, but I want to invite you into a journey to read the Bible from a historical context. Everything I'm going to suggest here is not my opinion. This is scholarly work that is easily verifiable. I'm going to recommend some resources that you can go and check out for yourself. But today, I want to focus on the Genesis creation stories. And I say stories, plural, because we have two different creation stories found in the book of Genesis. But before we even do that, I want to invite you to rethink how you have been taught to read the Bible. And here is what I mean by that. Most of us were taught to read the Bible from a devotional approach. The devotional approach asks very personal questions. For example, what does this mean for my life? As I'm reading a text, what does this mean for my life? And so I was taught, when you're reading the Bible, this is your time to commune with God, which is true if you are a follower of Jesus and that you subscribe to that. And you're asking yourself every time you're reading the text, what does this mean for my life? And secondly, what is God trying to say to me through this text? It's a very personal application of the Bible. Now, truth be told, this creates all kinds of problems because you begin to see everything in the Bible as a personal message to you, which is not true and not the correct way of approaching the Bible. Because, as I always say to people, the Bible was not written to us. The Bible had a very specific audience in mind. And in fact, the authors, and I say the authors, plural, because the Bible is a compilation of books with different authors who had their own agendas and perspectives and theological agendas when compiling the text of the Bible. So the devotional approach does not lend itself to pulling the thread that has actually informed the formation of the Bible. The other approach, which I advocate, is the historical approach, because the historical approach asks very different questions. So, for example, when was this created? We look at time in history. What exactly was happening around that time? Who authored it? Who is behind this text? In church world, and most Christians are raised to think about the Bible in terms of a text that is inspired by God. What do we even mean that the Bible is inspired by God? In some schools of thought, there are several theories around inspiration. For example, there's the dictation theory, where basically somebody goes into a trance and God spoke to them and through them, and they wrote the text. Then we also have the anthropomneustos perspective, which says that God is the primary source of the inspiration, but then the human authors are the immediate source, and they filter the text through their own life experiences and cultural settings. So the historical perspective begins to pull the thread to kind of understand who authored this and for which community was it intended. Because again, the Bible was not written to us. I know we like to think that this compilation of 66 books somehow was written to us in this world here and now. And then it also asks what political influences affected the writing of the text. Because the Bible texts do not exist in a vacuum. They exist within a political culture and social culture, and people are writing from their perspective. And then it also asks, what did it signify before Christianity interpreted it? Okay, so for example, when we look at the Hebrew text, the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, we have to ask ourselves, what did the Old Testament mean before Christians began to interpret the Old Testament? That is the historical approach to the Bible. So, with that said, I want to invite you into the ancient context that gave birth to the Hebrew Bible, and that is the ancient Near East. And you're going to see this abbreviation ANE over and over again. But this is the world that shaped the Hebrew Bible. What exactly, or not maybe what, but what constitutes the ancient Near East? Let's start from here. First of all, by the way, I'm talking about the period between 3500 to 300 BCE. BCE is simply before the Common Era. CE is the Common Era. So just in case you see that abbreviation, that's what we mean. The first land that kind of defines, not in any order of importance, but one of the first ones that defines the ancient Near East is Mesopotamia, which literally means the land between two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates. All right. So what modern countries are involved here, or what ancient cities are involved here? We're talking about Babylon. We're talking about Nineveh. Babylon, by the way, is modern day Iraq. Nineveh, some of you that have read the story of Abraham in the Bible know that he was from the Ur of the Chaldeans, right? Nippur or Nipa, and then Assur. All right. The pronunciations are neither here nor there. My African will sneak in here, but you get the point. Mesopotamia was one of the lands of the ancient Near East. The second one is Syria. And here is one of the most important cities when it comes to understanding the Bible, and that is Ugarit, which is the modern Ras Sharma, right? In 1929, a collection of texts called the Ugaritic texts were discovered at this place, and they shed a lot of light into the religious history of the ancient Near East, but most importantly, how that history actually shaped or informed the Bible and the biblical writers. All right. Also, Aram, which is around the Damascus area, is also found in Syria, and their language and scribal traditions intersected with Israel throughout the biblical period. So the Israelites basically learned keeping records and writing from some of these ancient Near Eastern cultures and religions. And there's also Lebanon and Palestine, the ancient Phoenicia and Canaan, right? Canaan, we know the Canaanite religious world influenced a lot of what Israel came to learn. For example, the god El, all right? Canaanite god El was an important god. And in fact, the Israelites talk about El Elyon, El Shaddai. Those are Canaanite titles for the Canaanite god El. Baal is another god that we also find in the Bible. Asherah is another god that we find in the Bible. Again, this was not original to the Hebrews. They found themselves in this ancient Near Eastern area that had existed thousands of years before them. This area already had religions. This area already had their gods. They had a culture. They were writing their culture. And so when the Hebrew people arrive in this area, they begin to learn about the people that live there and actually begin to adopt some of their religious practices and customs. And in later videos, you're going to see the journey that the Hebrews take from being a foreign tribe that arrives in ancient Near East and adopts a lot of their religious views and then become monotheistic. And we're going to look at that. But another concept that the Hebrews actually borrow from Lebanon and Palestine area, this Canaan place, is the concept of the divine council. Psalm 82 talks about the concept of the divine council. The book of Daniel talks about the concept of the divine council. The divine council concept basically is that God does not rule alone. God has a pantheon of gods that he rules over, that rule with him. All these concepts are concepts that the Hebrews incorporated into the Bible. All right, let's keep on going here for a second. All right. Egypt, of course. Egypt is in the ancient Near East. Egypt informs a lot of what the Hebrew Bible becomes. And the wisdom literature of the Bible, for example, Proverbs 22 is literally a parallel to an Egyptian text or instruction of Amenemope, right? And the Israelites or the writer of Proverbs takes from Egyptian wisdom writing and imports that into the Hebrew Bible. So I hope that you can already see, just from a cursory exploration of the ancient Near East, that the Bible is not a book that exists in a vacuum. It is a book that exists and is informed a lot by the cultures and religions of the place where the Hebrews found themselves. Let's keep on going here. All right, Turkey, home of the Hittite Empire, right? If you have read of the Hittites in the Bible, this is where they were, Turkey. And then, of course, Persia. Persia, home of the Persian Empire under Cyrus the Great. The Torah actually mostly reaches its final form in Persia, it is believed. Okay, now I want to talk in depth about the religions of the ancient Near East. And I'm going to slow down here for a second because the religions and the religious practices of the ancient Near East inform a lot of what the Hebrews actually incorporate into Judaism. And I want to start by, first of all, introducing you to the perspective that the people that lived around this area had when it came to their religion. So let's get started. They practiced what we call polytheism. Polytheism is the belief in the worship of multiple gods. Polytheism is the belief in and worship of multiple gods. So even in the Bible, you find that the Hebrews refer to the gods of the other nations. In a later video, I'm going to talk to you about the invention of Yahweh, or how does Yahweh come to be. And it's a very, very fascinating story and journey that the Hebrews actually take from polytheism to monotheism, all right? Now, actually, before I even go there, so you have polytheism, which is the belief in and the worship of many gods. Then you have henotheism, which is a belief in many gods, but the worship of only one, right? You believe that the other gods exist, but you only worship one. Monotheism, which is really the invention of Judaism or the Hebrew people, is the belief and worship of only one God. Now, how that one God comes to be out of many is a journey that is fascinating, and I guarantee you, you do not want to miss that video. All right, let's keep on going here. Now, these gods existed in a pantheon. All the gods in a polytheistic belief system were collectively called a pantheon. All right, so a pantheon of gods, and you're going to always hear that. And polytheistic systems warrant a little bit more of an exploration. So the ancient Near Eastern religions were sophisticated and were very mature. Sorry for the typo. All right. So here's what I mean. They had religious literature. They wrote about their gods. They wrote about the origins of their gods. They wrote about how they worship their gods. They wrote about what was acceptable and unacceptable to their gods. They also had a cosmological mythology. Basically, they had a mythology about how did the world come to be? Where did people come from? Where did humans come from? Where did animals come from? They had very, very sophisticated stories around the origin of the world. Now, remember, they are thousands of years older than the Hebrews who come to write the Bible. The Hebrews arrive in the ancient Near East and find a people that live there who have sophisticated religious literature, a sophisticated cosmological mythology. And we're going to talk about what mythology is in a second here. Legal traditions. These people are already writing constitutions and laws and how to interact with each other and what is punishable by law, etc., etc. How do they conduct commerce and how do they keep business records? All those things are baked into this polytheistic system that is already mature, way more than this small group of Hebrew people that have found themselves in this space. They also had prophetic practices. The idea most Christians have is that only Christians or Christianity has a prophetic element. That is not true. These ancient religions believed in prophecy. In fact, one of the prophets in the Bible, Balaam, actually has prophecies rooted in these Near Eastern religions. All right. So the whole concept of prophecy is not something that is unique to the Bible. These ancient systems, these ancient religions practiced prophecy. Also, scribal institutions. And basically what we mean by this is that you had, for lack of a better word, priests and people that were given to writing these religious texts. They had a scribal community, something that develops over time when it comes to the Israelites, the Hebrew people. Okay, so these polytheistic systems were actually complicated systems, mature systems, systems that were on the cutting edge for their time. Now, let's talk about mythology. And I want to define mythology from a scholarly perspective, because most of the time when people hear myth or mythology, they automatically think false, something that is made up, a fairy tale. And I want to define that because you're going to hear about cosmological mythology when we get to the creation stories of the Bible. So let's get started. Okay. So here's a common understanding of what mythology is. And it's this, it's a myth. A myth is a false story, like a fairy tale or a belief held by primitive people before they gained more knowledge. So when you hear the word mythology or myth, this is what comes to mind. However, the scholarly definition of this is that it's a sacred story that a community uses to explain fundamental truths such as the origin of the world, the nature of the divine, the reasons for human suffering, and what gives life meaning. All right. So when a scholar, when somebody who studies history hears or uses mythology, they're talking about a sacred story that a community uses to explain some fundamental truths, such as the origin of the world. Where did the world come from? How was it created? Where did people come from? How were they created? All right. When we begin to ask those questions as scholars, we're talking about mythology. All right. Now, the scholarly understanding in this context, myth does not mean or does not indicate whether the story is historically accurate. Okay. when scholars look at mythology, they're not looking for historical accuracy. Rather, it emphasizes the role that the story plays for that community, not its factual correctness, right? In other words, we look at a community to say, okay, they have this sacred story. What does this sacred story mean to them? We are not really interested in, did these things actually happen? Can we prove them from historical fact? No, we're looking at what role does this story actually play in this community, and how does it actually inform how they live and how they worship, how they interact with each other, how they interpret suffering, etc., etc. So when we as scholars come at mythology, we are looking at it from this perspective, okay? Our definition here at Honest Ground is this. A myth is a fundamental cultural story that illustrates a community's core beliefs about divine, human, and cosmic realities through narrative. That we use story. We believe that people use story to communicate their core beliefs about the divine, about human and cosmic realities. Okay, that is our definition of what mythology is. Its authority comes from the insights it offers about meaning, not from historical accuracy. Again, we're not interested in whether these things actually happened. Can I prove them beyond a reasonable shadow of doubt that this actually happened? We acknowledge that this is a story, but most important to us is, what does this story actually mean for the people that believe in it? Okay, I hope that that is clear. With that said, I want us now to dive into the Hebrew Bible and begin to basically look at how it was written and why. Okay, this will serve as an introduction to the Hebrew Bible. And then going forward, we will dive more into some juicy stuff that you don't want to miss. All right, let's go. Okay, I want to introduce to you something called the documentary hypothesis. It's a model that is used by scholars and theologians to kind of understand the Hebrew Bible. Now, this theory was mainly developed by Julius Wellhausen in about 1878, and it was based on research even outside himself, but it basically suggested that Genesis through Deuteronomy, for example, is not the work of one author. And this was a radical idea because at the time, and still many still believe this, that people believe that the first 5 books of the Bible were written by Moses. What Wellhausen came and said was, through research, his own, and the research of other scholars, was like, there is evidence here to show that the first 5 books of the Bible are actually the work of multiple authors and living at different times, trying to say something based on their cultural setting and or socio-political agendas. So instead, he said it is a composite text meant from 4 different literary traditions, each with its own vocabulary, each with its own theology, and each with its own historical background. That's what Wellhausen said. And of course, this was a groundbreaking idea. He was one of the first people that kind of brought the scholarly research up until that time into a model, and he called it the documentary hypothesis model. So before we even go deeper into the creation accounts, I want us to really look at what is this model, because it will begin to open your heart and mind to having a different perspective on the Hebrew Bible. So it comes from 4 sources. The 4 sources are Yahwist, which is denoted by the letter J, Elohist or Elohist, which is denoted by the letter E, Deuteronomist, which is denoted by the letter D, and Priestly, which is denoted by the letter P. And you will see this when you're reading either theology or Old Testament research. You're going to see this abbreviation JEDP. and it simply stands for Yahwist, Elohist, Deuteronomist, and priestly sources of the Hebrew Bible. Let us dive deeper into each one of these sources. Let's look first at the Yahwist. German is spelled that way, Yahwist with a J, hence the abbreviation with a J. It uses the divine name Yahweh from the very beginning. That's how you know that this is a Yahwist source. Uses Yahweh from the very beginning. And then it's generally dated to about the 10th or 9th century BCE, likely originating in Judah. That is the general consensus around the Yahwist source. And it is responsible for most of the Eden narrative and J strand of the flood story. So basically what that means is that most of some of the Eden narrative, what happens in the Garden of Eden, the fall of man, for example, and part of Noah's story is from this J source, the Yahwist source. Okay, so when Bible scholars are reading these first 5 books of the Bible, they are looking to see, where does this particular passage of scripture come from? What is the source of the scripture? Now, just remember that these sources are not written at the same time. Like this one is written, dated to about 10th or 9th century BCE, right? It is not written at the same time as the other texts, as we shall see. So the next source is Elohist, the Elohist source, or the E source. The E source uses Elohim for God until the divine name is revealed to Moses. Okay, so this particular source uses Elohim over and over again until you get to Exodus chapter number 3, where God reveals himself to Moses as Yahweh. Right? So when scholars, again, are reading the first 5 books of the Bible, they're looking to see, where does this particular passage, what is the source of this particular passage? And they kind of put a source in the Elohist bucket if it uses Elohim a lot. All right? And more northern in perspective, it is more concerned with prophecy, more concerned with concepts of the fear of God. Again, when you're reading this and you find prophecy, you find the concepts of the fear of God, chances are that the source of the particular passage, again, is Elohist. And it is dated to about 9th to 8th century BCE, likely originating in the Northern Kingdom. Now, remember, we said J likely was around 10th or 9th BCE and originating in Judah. Again, these are about 100 to 200 years apart, likely originating in the Northern Kingdom. I'm hoping that you're beginning to see, again, that the Bible is not a book that is simply written by people sitting in one sitting and just writing it. I mean, we're talking about hundreds of years apart when this comes together. All right. And then fragmentary, and it is fragmentary, and therefore many scholars debate whether this source is a coherent source or a collection of scattered additions. All right. Because of that, just the fragmentation of how the source flows, how the passages flow. Many scholars say it cannot be trusted as a coherent source because of its scattered additions. Okay, that is the E source. Then the D source, which is a Deuteronomist source, is almost entirely confined to Deuteronomy, hence Deuteronomist. Its editorial framework actually is used for the books of Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. So basically, how the book is structured, the framework of Deuteronomy is actually extrapolated across these other books of the Bible. That's how, again, people are able to realize to say the editors or the writers of Deuteronomy are actually responsible for writing the books of Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. And when you begin to understand the agenda behind the Deuteronomist editors, that's when you can begin to see the connections between these other books, because they are really concerned with the establishment of the kingdom. So laws are important, kings are important, systems of governance and systems of religious worship are important. Okay, it uses distinctive vocabulary, again, preoccupied with covenant faithfulness, centralized worship in Jerusalem. These are concepts driven by the D source. And scholars connected to Josiah's reform and the book found in the temple in around 622 BCE. They say that this book and this collection of works actually came together in Josiah's reforms, because Josiah, again, had a very socio-political reason for making sure that there was a defined and well-organized perspective when it came to religious worship and how monarchies are formed and should rule and reign, etc., etc. And the last source is the P source, which is the priestly source. It is formal, it is structural, it is liturgical. It uses Elohim exclusively, again, until Exodus chapter number 6. It is obsessed with genealogies. I mean, this one beget that. This one was the father of this one, etc., etc. It is obsessed with dates. It is obsessed with measurements. You know, you have to build this according to such and such cubic feet, and etc., etc. Purity laws. Think of Leviticus here. And priestly ritual. Again, think of Leviticus here. The priestly source is where all that information comes from. And it is where we get Genesis 1's creation account. It is largely a priestly or P source. Again, it is dated to the exilic or post-exilic period, 6th to 5th century BCE, likely composed by priestly communities during or after the Babylonian exile. Okay, again, if you look at the D source timing versus the E source versus the J source, you're talking about, from the J source to here, you're talking about 500 years. Friends, again, not to belabor the point, the Bible is not as linear as many people have been taught to think. No, it took hundreds of years, multiple authors, editors that sat down to compose what we have come to know as the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament. This is the P source. Okay, I hope that this gives you a little bit of perspective. And I took the time to write these notes and post them on the screen so that if you want, you can take screenshots. There is an academic paper that I have been working on. I'm editing it right now. And if you're interested in that, I'll make that available as well at some point, and I will let you know. Because I think it gives you a bibliography. You can see the sources of where this information came from. So if you want to dig a little bit deeper, I find myself reading heavily these days. So I'm talking about 500, 600 page books. I'm fascinated with this stuff. All right. So here is what the theory basically says. The hypothesis says these four sources were composed independently over several centuries, then gradually over time combined. J and E were merged first, then D was later added. Then P was either layered throughout or assembled as a whole. So this produced something close to the Torah that we have around 5th century BCE, probably under Ezra's influence during the Persian period. Okay, That is general consensus among scholars in terms of how these probably came together. Now, what the theory doesn't say, because what it says is just as important as what it doesn't say. Here, it does not say that the Torah is therefore unreliable or without value. Again, I will take you back to mythology. We're not interested in the historical accuracy of a text, but rather we're interested in what function or role does this story or narrative play for the people that actually believe in it. It says that the Torah is a library of multiple voices, centuries of tradition, and diverse theological emphases, all compiled into a single narrative. Okay, it preserves the tensions between the sources rather than erasing them. For example, as you will see later on in another video, the two Genesis accounts. All right, so this is not to say that the Torah is unreliable or without value. We place it in the bucket of mythology. Not that it is not true, but rather we accept the fact that there concepts and or stories in the Torah that cannot be historically verified. However, they play a very important role to the people that actually believe in it. Here is what actually is a scholarly debate. The debate is that E has been questioned as a coherent independent source. And some scholars actually collapse J and E. Others propose entirely different compositional models, right? So this entire model, the documentary hypothesis model, is not the final authority. These are things that keep on being debated, especially as scholarship gets access to more information. But the existence of P as a distinct source and D as another remains among the most stable conclusions in Pentateuchal scholarship, okay? Those people that study the first 5 books of the Bible kind of say, hey, listen, we have looked at this, we live with this, we breathe this, and P and D remain the most stable conclusions when it comes to source and composition, etc., etc. All right? Now, I want to talk about cosmological mythology. Stories from the ancient Near Eastern religions and how biblical writers used them to write the creation story of Genesis. And this is where I'll pick up next time. God bless you.